There you go. I'll get the door.
Okay. So, I'm Emily.
I'm Madison.
And I'm Brady.
And thank you.
Hi, nice to meet you.
too.
So I'm Dr. Tuivo Dang, and I'm the curator for UCI Library Southeast Asian Archive.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks for letting us interview you.
Of course. So do you want to tell me a little bit more about your project for National History Day?
Okay. So, like, our theme for this year is like breaking barriers, in history, and so on our list we picked the Indo-Chinese refugees. So, do you want to continue?
And so we've interviewed a few other people, some refugees, and then we've interviewed someone in our community whose church helped a family who came over.
He was one of the sponsors, or his church was, or something like that?
Yeah, his church was a sponsor for that. Yeah.
And so, kind of, what's your main idea? What are the barriers? What's your main thesis or your main thoughts?
Brady, you have the thesis in there.
Oh, come on, you guys.
So we're thinking that they broke, like, economical, cultural, physical, geographical, and some other language barriers, like that.
And they came over to the U.S.
Mm-hmm. You want to say the thesis? I can't think of it off the top of my head right there.
And I understand that you're in 8th grade?
Sixth grade. So they're 11 and 12 years old, and they're a little bit on the nervous side, so please forgive them. They usually talk a lot more and giggle more than they are at the moment. So, but they're 6th graders.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not able to hear Mrs. Healy.
Okay, would you tell her?
Okay, so we're actually 6th graders.
6th grade, okay.
And so
Awesome.
I'm 11, and they're both 12?
I'm 12.
No, she's 11.
And I'm 12.
Yeah.
Okay, very cool. Okay, so what do you need from me today?
So we have some questions for you.
You asked the first one.
And speak up.
Okay. So, how did the Southeast Asian refugees overcome the barriers they faced during immigration?
So I'm going to first give you a little bit of background on the collections that I manage, and also a little bit of personal history, since I'm also a Vietnamese refugee myself. Our collection at UC Irvine is on Cambodian, Laotian, Hmong, and Vietnamese refugees mainly, and then of course later immigrants that came from those countries after the war. And so the first mass migration happened in 1975, right at the end of the Vietnam-American War. And right after the fall of Saigon, the United States received about 130,000 Southeast Asian refugees through 4 of its military camps that were military bases that were converted into refugee camps. They were in California, Arkansas, Florida, and Pennsylvania. And so the idea for that first group, to receive them that way across the country was to spread them out, right? So the United States government had this idea that if they sent refugees out across America, there wouldn't be one state or one region that would suffer the most economic impact from having to assist refugees at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And, one thing that resettlement policy didn't really consider was the will and the agency, so like what people wanted, right? So Southeast Asian refugees came through various ways. They came by boat, they came by plane, and when they arrived, many of them were separated from their families and their friends. So one of the main challenges was how to reunite with them. So they did what we call secondary migration, which is leaving those refugee camps and then finding their way to unite with their family and friends. And so that's why here in California, in Southern California, we have the largest community of Vietnamese anywhere in the world outside of Vietnam. It's because people really wanted to be together, right? Have the same food and culture and language and support each other in a community. So that's one of the big challenges, I think, was the separation of families. And then later, after that first group who were evacuated from Vietnam and Cambodia, you have what's popularly known as the boat people refugees, right?
Yeah.
So in the late 70s and through the 1980s, you had a lot of people escaping by boat. And some of those challenges that they faced were the dangers of trying to leave their country that way. Right? Many people didn't make it. They died in the South China Seas. They confronted situations like pirates. And then, of course, starvation, disease, many challenges and barriers. And then when they did make it, they usually arrived at what's known as a first asylum camp. So those camps would be in Southeast Asia, Hong Kong. And while they're there, the conditions weren't great. There was a lot of overcrowding. People, they weren't comfortable. And so that was another kind of challenge that was faced by Southeast Asian refugees. And one way that the refugees at the time dealt with those challenges, people who had language skills, like English language skills, or they may speak French or Australian or whatever Western language that they learned in addition to their own language, they would step up and volunteer and try to help, organize the camps so that people who needed help could get that help, right? With like writing letters to family members, writing letters to help with their case, because before you can be resettled, you had to go through a very tough process of being determined a refugee. So you'd be interviewed, there'd be a medical exam. It wasn't just about like escaping and then getting somewhere, right? You had to go through all of these obstacles before you could resettle and start your new lives. So I think that, one thing I've learned from seeing a lot of the historical materials is that there are so many challenges that Southeast Asian refugees face, but what they showed was a lot of resilience to address those challenges and to overcome them and eventually be able to resettle and build new lives and new communities in the U.S.
Okay, so so what helped the refugees? So, can you tell us your story?
Sure. I left Vietnam with my family. I was a child. I was 3 years old. One of, at the time, 7 children. My parents actually have 9 kids now. But at the time that we left Vietnam in 1983, I was 3 going on 4. I was almost 4 years old. And my father figured out how to get all of us out. We had no money. We were from a village in South Vietnam. And he had served in the war, the military. But he was injured. He was wounded, so he got out early in the early 1970s. So he didn't have a whole lot of opportunities to raise his children. After the war ended, he didn't see a future for us to be able to go to school, to be able to have a better life. So the only option he saw was to try to leave. And we were very lucky. We got out of South Vietnam and we made it safely to Malaysia. That was our first asylum camp. And of course, I don't have any memories of that camp because I was too little. We stayed there for nearly a year while we were being interviewed, while our case was being prepared, right? And then once it was determined that my family, we were truly refugees, we were transported to the Philippines. The United States have military bases, all over the world, and one of its bases is in Bataan, Philippines, which is where my family was transferred. That became another refugee camp. And my first memory is actually from the Philippines. So I was about 4.5, and I remember sitting in a row with lots of other kids. They may have been my siblings. They may have been other kids that my family met in the camp. And we were being fed rice and something else. And I just remember someone feeding us with their hands. So no utensils, just kind of scooping up rice and feeding us in a row like little birds. And I kind of remember that there was a lot of dirt. And as a kid, you don't really have a sense of what's dirty and what's clean and, health conditions and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do remember the sense of not being secure, not being full. Like we were hungry a lot, or I was hungry a lot as a kid in that camp. So finally, my family was sponsored. Oh, and in the Philippines, my mom had another baby, so that made 8 of us. He was a boy. And then my family got sponsored by a Lutheran church in Jamestown, New York. And so we were waiting for a large organization to sponsor us because we're such a big group. So we were very lucky we got to Jamestown, New York with this church. And when we got there, we were the only refugee family there. And the sponsors, the church was very generous. There were so many people in the church who, wanted to help each one of us individually. So I had 2 sponsors who were members of the church. And they did things like pick me up and bring clothing for me and take me out to eat and just check in on me. And to this day, one of those sponsors, her name is Julie. She and I are friends. Even though I've moved across the country, we kept in touch for years and years as pen pals.
Mm-hmm.
And she kept all of my letters and all of the pictures I drew her as a kid. And I've been able to visit her a few times. So we have a very special friendship that was created out of a very difficult circumstance. But so my family, after we were sponsored to Jamestown, my dad figured out that we couldn't live there because it was too cold. Now, Vietnam is a tropical Southeast Asian country, right? So the weather there is kind of like Hawaii, very tropical and warm year-round. So when we got to Jamestown, it was the summer, around June. So it was still hot, and we didn't know how cold it would get. But my dad, who's very smart, figured out that it was going to get really cold and that he didn't have the skills or the language ability to make a living in upstate New York.
Mm-hmm.
So he packed us all into a Greyhound bus. It's one of those, large buses that go across country. And we headed west to California. And that was the mid-'80s. And in California, we came straight to Orange County. And that's where my mom had the last kid, my youngest brother. He was the only American-born child in my family. So that's our story of kind of early resettlement experience. And I think it really also emphasized what I mentioned earlier, which is the will and the agency of Southeast Asians. So even though they were being resettled and scattered across the country,
Mm-hmm.
because the government didn't want us to, be a burden on any one state, we also made choices. We also decided where we could and couldn't live. And so my family went through that process of secondary migration. And my dad had heard that there were Vietnamese people in California. And we thought that's where we should go.
Okay, Madison, do you want to ask the next question?
1 second.
Take the first, the second one.
Okay. What helped move the refugees towards assimilation?
I think, the sponsorship process was very